Hello and welcome to another lecture on basic macroeconomics. Today it is our fifth lecture on basic macroeconomics and the topic is structural transformation. In last lecture we learnt about the structure of an economy. Basically we divide an economy into its major components which we call as sectors. And we learnt about 3 sector classification, 5 sector classification and 13 sector classification in the last lecture. Now let us focus on 3 sector classification. That is, an economy is divided into 3 major components: the primary sector, the secondary sector and the tertiary sector. Now each of these sectors obviously produces GDP and it provides employment, generates employment in an economy. However, the GDP produced and employment generated by these 3 sectors is not the same. Usually it is different. Now, if one sector provides more employment and GDP, obviously that very sector becomes the prime sector, important sector for the economy. Now, over the period of time, there is a transformation, a change. The employment generated and GDP provided by these sectors, it changes. The ratio and the proportion of GDP provided by these sectors, it changes. For example, in the earlier case, it may be the primary sector which provides more employment and generates more GDP. But at a later stage of the economy, it may be the secondary sector which provides more employment or generates more GDP. Or for that matter, it can be the tertiary sector as well. So this very transformation, this very change in the relative importance of the sectors of an economy, this is what we call as structural transformation. So we define or describe structural transformation as the relative importance of sectors in economy changes when the relative importance of the sectors in an economy changes, we call that very process as structural transformation. So what is the source of structural transformation? Basically, one thing we need to keep in mind is that the 3 sectors of an economy, they do not grow at the same pace. For example, in the beginning, it may be the primary sector which grows at more pace, but at a later stage, as technology advances, it may be the secondary sector which grows at more pace. And finally, at further later stage, it may be the tertiary sector which grows at more pace in comparison to other 2 sectors. Now, if the growth rate in a particular sector is more than other sectors, that means that sector with the passage of time is going to become the major sector of an economy. So when growth rates are different between 3 different sectors, then with the passage of time, a particular sector is going to predominate. And if growth rate is changed now, earlier it was one sector which was growing at more pace, and now it is another sector which is growing at more pace, that means now the structure of the economy, the contribution in terms of GDP and employment is also going to change with the passage of time. Now, there is a model which was propounded in 1940s, particularly after actually the establishment of macroeconomics, which we call as the 3-sector model. And it is the basis of this very idea of structural transformation. Now, what is this 3-sector model? I will read out the main description of the 3-sector model. It says the main focus of an economy's activity shifts from the primary through the secondary and finally to the tertiary sector. The economic activity is taking place in an economy. In the beginning, the focus of these economic activities is the primary sector. But as the economy progresses, the secondary sector becomes the focus of economic activities. That is, most of the economic activities or a major bulk of the economic activities is now taking place in the secondary sector. But at a later stage, the focus of an economy's activities becomes the 3rd sector, the tertiary sector, services sector. So there is a process starts in which the primacy of sectors shifts. First it is the primary sector, then the secondary sector, and later on at the final stage it is the tertiary sector, which becomes the focus of economic activities, which becomes the most important sector of an economy. Now we can put it this way as well. Now when an economy has low income, when for example per capita income is low or GDP is low, what happens is that at that time it is the primary sector which is important for the economy. However, with the passage of time, as progress takes place, technological progress now it lays its roots in the economy. What happens is that the secondary sector becomes more important. So as income of the economy increases, secondary sector represents the economy in a way. We can say it is the secondary sector which is the growth engine for the economy. But at a later stage, when income grows even further, it grows more, it becomes the maximum, moves towards the upper end. What happens? It is the tertiary sector which becomes the engine of growth for the economy, or which is the mainstay of the economic activities in that very economy. More GDP is produced in the tertiary sector, and much employment is provided by the tertiary sector. So low income corresponds with primary sector, middle income corresponds with secondary sector, and high income corresponds with the tertiary sector. And it is historically, we can say it is a natural process that takes place in any economy. Now the three sector model was propounded, it was put forward by some important economists in 1930s, 40s and 50s, we can say. One of them being Alan Fish, who provided his contribution in 1939. Then it is Colin Clark, 1940, and then we have Jean Forestier in 1949, the French economist. Now let us take the example of Jean Forestier, 1949, who divided the phases of economic transformation, what we call a structural change, in three. The first phase he called as traditional civilization, where the primary sector is the most important sector, providing 64.5% of the GDP. 20% is provided by the secondary sector, and 15.5% is contributed by the tertiary sector. Now in the first phase, the traditional civilization, it is the primary sector which rules the economy, which is the focus of an economy's activity. The second phase, the transition phase, he called it, 40% of GDP is contributed by the primary sector, then 40% by the secondary sector, and 20% by the tertiary sector. Now you can see here that the importance of primary sector is getting reduced, and that of the secondary sector, it is increasing significantly. And there is some progress in the tertiary sector as well. But in the third phase, which he calls as tertiary civilization, the primary sector importance of a primary sector, it reduces to 10% of GDP only, and 20% GDP is provided by the secondary sector, and 70% of the GDP, that is major bulk of the GDP, is now provided by the tertiary sector. This is the three sector model that was propounded by these three economists, and this is their understanding. Now there is something we call as petty clock law or petty clock theorem. What is this? Actually, two economists are obviously part of this very law or theorem in the background. They are the ones who are responsible for it. And the theorem says, as technical progress reduces transportation costs, the market for non-agriculture goods will expand, inducing the reallocation of labor from agriculture to non-agricultural activities. So they say that as technical progress becomes firm in a particular economy, transportation costs, they get reduced. So the non-agriculture goods get an incentive, they get a bigger market, and obviously more quantity of non-agriculture goods is produced. Now this is only possible when there is reallocation of labor from the primary sector to the secondary and tertiary sector. Okay, so there is migration of labor from primary sector to the secondary and tertiary sectors, and this transformation then takes place. More non-agriculture activities now take place in that very economy. Now this very idea was propounded in 1690s by Sir William Petty, and it was revived and brought forward by Colin Clark in 1930s. So this is why we call it Petty-Clark law or Petty-Clark theorem. So let us take a historical look at the structural transformation, where more employment is provided by the secondary and tertiary sectors, and where more GDP is produced by secondary and tertiary sectors in a sequential way. So let's take a view of employment in United States of America. In 1870, the primary sector provided 53.5% of employment in the United States of America. So more than half of the labor force was actually engaged in agriculture sector. Now come to 2000. Only 2% of the labor force is engaged in the primary sector. So this is a very, very significant transformation. We are moving that majority of the people were engaged in the primary sector, agriculture sector. Now the very minimal number of people are now engaged in the primary sector. So this is a big shift in the structure of the economy, and this is what we call as structural transformation. Now let us take an example of India. So this is sectoral contribution to GDP by different sectors, and we can see primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors, how much they are contributing. In 1960-61, the primary sector contributed 51% of the GDP. But in 2010-11, it is only producing 17% of the GDP. So you can see the relative importance of primary sector is reducing significantly. Now secondary sector, it was 18% in 1960-61, now it is 24.5%, so there is increase in that. But the tertiary sector, 31% in 1960-61, now it is 58.5% in 2010-11. So we can see there is a marked shift in the focus of economic activities. Earlier it was the primary sector which was the focus of economic activities in India. Now it is the tertiary sector. Earlier it was primary sector which was providing more than half of the GDP. Now it is the tertiary sector which is providing more than half of the GDP to the economy. So there is a significant shift from primary to the tertiary. Now if you take the case of the US economy, the GDP contribution, it is in 1965, 3% contribution is given by the primary sector, 38% by the secondary, and then 59% by the tertiary sector. Now in 2020, only 1% contribution is given by the primary sector, then 19% by the secondary sector, and 80% contribution given by the tertiary sector. Now this example is significant for us. If we assume that the Indian economy, with the passage of time, as more and more technical progress takes place, the economy progresses, develops further, then one day it may be possible that Indian economy is in the same condition as we find the US economy. So we have 17% of the GDP produced by the primary sector. In case of India, it may be 1% in coming future. Similarly, it is 58.5% by the tertiary sector. It may be 80% in the coming future, because economy is progressing in that very direction. So this is what we call as structural transformation. Now if we look at the employment share of different sectors in India, we find that in 1983 the primary sector contributed almost 69% of the employment, and now it is producing 2017-18, it is providing 44.6%. Labor force is engaged in the primary sector. Now in comparison, 13% employment was provided by the secondary sector, but it is now 24%, and 17.8% was provided by the tertiary sector in 1983, but it is now 31%. So there is significant change. There is significant shift from between different sectors in terms of employment as well. And this very process in which we see that the role of primary sector is reducing, it gets reduced both in both the parameters, employment and the GDP, and the role of the tertiary sector expands with the passage of time, with the passage of technical progress, and this very process we call as structural transformation. I hope that you have enjoyed the session and you have understood the concept of structural transformation, some important basic things which we keep in mind about structural transformation. Do subscribe to my YouTube channel, Macroeconomics. Thank you very much.